All right, I think we're working. Now I got three people on. Okay. So we're going to try this again. I did the whole, um, I did the whole thing before and didn't work. So I'm going to try it again. Things seem to be settling down here in terms of our internet. So hopefully this works. And so I'm just going to jump right into it and do this. Um, and every once in a while, I'm going to check this to make sure that, yeah, it seems like it's working. So, all right. I got to get my bearings here. So, um, we're in this little section of Matthew where I'm going to pull this mic in here a bit. We're in this little section of Matthew here where he is really showing examples, I guess maybe is a good way to say it, showing examples of the different topics that Jesus addresses to show a righteousness that exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees. And we talked about anger yesterday and lust and divorce. And today we're going to get into some other areas. And so verse 33, he says, again, you've heard that it was said. So this repeating this pattern, and this pattern will be repeated here throughout this little section here to the end of chapter 5. And there's this kind of bookend on this section at the end of chapter 5. It's going to really tie this whole section up, these various different topics. It'll kind of tie it up into a nice, neat package here. So he says, again, you've heard it said that it was to those heard. Again, you have heard that it was said to those of old, you shall not swear falsely, which is a reference then to do not bear false witness. Okay. Kind of a shout out to that commandment. But then he says, but shall perform to the Lord what you have sworn. Now, this was in a broader context. Again, what these scribes and Pharisees were doing was they would kind of follow the law, but then there was all these little loopholes that they would figure on how to get around it, and that's what Jesus is coming down on here. And he says, yeah, but you shall perform to the Lord what you have sworn. So what they would do is they would make these oaths, and we're going to see here that they'd make these oaths, and they would say, well, we're not going to swear by God. Okay, because then they felt like they had to carry through on that oath if they swore to God. So what they started to do here is, he says, but I say to you, do not take an oath at all. Just don't even do it, because of what you're doing. He says, either by heaven. So they would not swear by God, but they would say, I swear by heaven, or they would swear by earth, or by Jerusalem, or by our own head. And Jesus is saying, don't take an oath at all, either by heaven, for it is the throne of God. It's linked to God. So in a sense, you're still swearing by God, or by earth, for it is his footstool, again, linked to God, or by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great king, again, linked to God. And do not take an oath by your head, for you cannot make one hair white or black. You are God's creation. You are made in his image. And again, so there's a link to God. So by trying to sidestep all of this stuff, by trying to lessen your oath, you're still desecrating the name of God by not carrying through. And so they would say, well, it was a lesser oath because it was by heaven or by earth or by Jerusalem or by God's throne. And so therefore I can not keep it and be okay. Jesus says, don't even take it. Just let your yes be yes. And if it's yes, then let it be yes. If it's no, then let it be no. Don't look for ways to get around what you've said that you will do. Just be a person with integrity, a person of your word, and therefore your righteousness will surpass that of the scribes and the Pharisees. You know, we have sometimes we have problems. Some of us have problems saying no to people. You know, we want to say yes because deep down inside we want to please people, right? And so we say yes and then we don't follow through. And that's kind of what Jesus says. If your yes is yes, if you say yes, then let it be yes. If you say no, then let it be no. It's okay to say no. He says anything more than this comes from evil. If you make a vow, if you make an oath to someone and you have the intent of not following through on a technicality, Jesus says that comes from an evil place. So don't do it. Then he says, you have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. Now we're talking about retribution. The heading in my Bible says retaliation. It's not so much retaliation. It is really retribution, an equal suffering for suffering, so to speak, making it right. Okay. That's what we're talking about. And so that was kind of the general rule. And really, it's kind of the general rule that we live by today. I mean, our courts are loosely set up on this idea of an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. Let the punishment reflect the crime, right? And so he says, but I say to you, do not resist the one who is evil. But if anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to him the other also. And this slapping on the cheek, Jesus isn't referring to somebody doing violence against you. All right. This is often used for, pacifists in terms of serving in the military and things like that. And there are other reasons for that, but this is a verse that's often used for that. But Jesus isn't talking about a violence here. He's not talking about that issue. What he's talking about here, this slapping on the cheek was a backhand across the cheek, which was the greatest insult that you could levy against another person. So what Jesus is talking about here is not violence against another person. It's an insult against another person. And he says, if someone insults you in the most heinous way possible, let him do it again. If anyone would sue you and take your tunic, let him have your cloak as well. Couple different things. Well, three different things. Let me finish out. And if anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with him 2 miles. Give to the one who begs from you and do not refuse the one who would borrow from you. What Jesus seems to be saying here is he's saying, listen, hold on loosely to your personal rights. And some would say, well, then we're just being a doormat. I don't see it that way. When we hold on loosely to our rights, we're in control. We can choose to turn the other cheek. We can choose to give our cloak as well. We can choose to go the extra mile. We can choose to give to the one who begs. We can choose to borrow and be taken advantage of in every one of those situations. We can choose to say, you know what? I know I'm probably going to be taken advantage of here, but I'm okay with that. I'm going to be bigger than all of this. I'm not going to demand retribution. I'm not going to demand and stand up for my rights. I'm going to be bigger than that. And why? Well, we get that now, as Jesus says, you have heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. So these are closely related. All of these are kind of closely related. But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. So when you pray for your enemy, Jesus isn't saying, hey, pray that your enemy, ill would come to your enemy. That's not what he's saying. Jesus is saying, pray for your enemy in such a way that you pray God's blessing on them. Pray for those who persecute you. Love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, so that you may be sons of your Father who is in heaven. In other words, you can reflect the nature and character of your heavenly Father. And how does that reflect the nature and character of your heavenly Father? Well, Jesus tells us, for he makes his sun rise on the evil and on the good, and sends rain on the just and on the unjust. There are instances generally, and we're not talking about a universal salvation here. Some have tried to use this passage for that. That's not what we're talking about. What Jesus is talking about is in a general way, in terms of how God treats his creation generally. He does not show partiality. He doesn't send the sun to just rise on the just. He doesn't send rain so it rains just on the just. He sends general rain. There's this general grace that's given to all of humanity. I mean, we could go so far as to say, gravity applies to all of us. God doesn't just let those of us who are just or forgiven to stay on the earth with gravity, and he makes gravity not. And so there's this general grace given to humanity that is impartial. And Jesus is saying, reflect the nature and character of your heavenly Father. Be impartial. He says, for if you love those who love you, what reward do you have? Do not even the tax collectors do the same? And if you greet only your brothers, and by brothers, Jesus is referring to, for them, it would have been fellow Jews. For us, it's fellow Christians, right? If you greet only your fellow Christians, what more are you doing than others? Do not even the Gentiles do the same? So God does not show partiality. And so why should we reflect the nature of God? I think Jesus is saying, not in so many words, but he's saying, listen, remember that while you were yet enemies, I died for you. At one time, we were enemies of God, right? Yet we were the ungodly. And so when we begin to show partiality towards others based upon just or unjust, we do not reflect the character and the nature of our Heavenly Father, who doesn't show that kind of impartiality. So that's why Jesus says, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. Be different. Reflect the nature and character of your Heavenly Father, because that is how he treated you. So treat others in that same way. And here's the bookend. This is the how can I say this? This is the explanation, so to speak, of a righteousness that exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees. Verse 48, you therefore must be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect. Now, is Jesus again giving us this kind of legalistic rule? No. Let me maybe paraphrase it in this way. A righteousness that exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees is a righteousness that reflects the character and priorities and the nature of God. That is a heart thing. That is it's a heart issue, not a head, not a rule issue. It's a heart issue. And so we can treat others differently because we've been treated differently by God. And all of these areas, whether it's anger, lust, divorce, oaths, um, retribution, loving our enemies, all of these things really boil down to how we treat others. And how we treat others, we ought to treat others the way God treats us, the way God treated us. We pass that on. Why? Because we reflect the nature in a way that is going to create a stir, in a way that is going to make an impact in the world around us. So there's so much more in this whole section of, kind of lens on to say these are areas where Jesus is talking about our righteousness exceeding that of the scribes and Pharisees. And he's going to continue on as we get into chapter 6. So he's going to continue on and talk more about righteousness and this kind of thing. But this is like a little subsection within the Sermon on the Mount as Matthew records it. And so it's just an interesting study and would, again, encourage you in that. So again, I'm hoping that this has recorded. It seems like it's working more like normal. So we'll see. Hopefully it did. If not, hope this all works again tomorrow. All right. So until then, God bless, be well, and be safe.